But the time he was going to it, it was also Unitarian. Unitarian faith has been one of the hallmarks of Adventism from its very inception. James White came from the Christian connection. He was Unitarian until the day of his death. Ellen White came from the Methodists, but she had left it by the time she was 8 or 9 years old, and she never wrote a line that suggested that she believed anything but that Christ was subordinate to the Father. Uriah Smith was a known Unitarian till the day of his death. I have a book that was put out by the Adventist General Conference in 1922 for the education of the ministerial students in all of their colleges. And that book presents Christ as subordinate, having derived life. The 1938 church manual that was put out by the French Conference of Adventists quotes the words of the well-known Unitarian martyr Michael Servetus, who was killed by Calvin himself, actually. Calvin came out in front of the cathedral. I've stood on the spot. There's a statue to Michael Servetus there that the Calvinists have put up in shame for what they did. They tied him to the stake. They piled brush about him. Calvin came out and said, "You've got one last chance. Just confess that Jesus Christ is the eternal Son of God." And Michael Servetus said, "I confess that Jesus Christ is the Son of the eternal God." And Calvin became so angry his face turned red, and he said, "Light the flames." And Michael Servetus died for his faith in the one true God and for his opposition to the Trinity. In the Seventh-day Adventist statement of faith in French, this sentence is quoted: "We believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of the eternal God." And this was a blatant statement in behalf of Unitarianism. And that was just before World War II. In fact, there was no official statement by the Adventist Church accepting Trinitarianism before the publication of Questions on Doctrines, which was a product of the discussions with Dr. Barnhouse in Washington with the Adventist leaders, at which time the Adventist leaders capitulated both the moderate Unitarian stand of Adventism and their belief in the continuing atonement, upon which the unique Adventist doctrine of the sanctuary rests, without which there is absolutely no need for a sanctuary doctrine or for the Adventist Church to exist. But they repudiated both of those doctrines under the influence of evangelical Christians, and a little more than 20 years later finally incorporated a Trinitarian formulation in their statement of beliefs. So Trinitarianism in Adventism is something that came in my lifetime. I remember when it happened. Of course, with changes of doctrine, people have the tendency to say this is what we always believed. But that's just not true. The Adventist Church was a Unitarian, moderate Unitarian, all through its existence. They believed in the pre-existence of Christ, but not that Christ was equal with the Father, but that he had derived life. So here you have the history of how these different churches have changed, and also a little of the history of how some people on the edges of the great churches, people carrying on a simple, humble faith down through the centuries, all the way back to the Apostolic Church.
Most of it's...
So how did it happen that a well-established church could reverse itself on its doctrines, as happened to the Adventist Church? How did they become Trinitarian when once one of their central doctrines was the messianic role of Christ within a Unitarian context. Well, it happened in 1978, whenever it was, the Dallas Conference, 1958, the discussions. But how could that actually be accomplished? Well, this is typical of what has happened down through the ages. As soon as there's a visible church, it's infiltrated. As soon as there is a visible church that accepts the Sabbath, that accepts the unity of God, there are people who come into it, and there's a very precise process of how that happens. Well, Adventists wanted to be like other Christians, and that was a strong point that pushed them toward this change in doctrine. And we see this happening even more recently in the Worldwide Church of God, this change in doctrine, the Sabbath being soft-pedaled and disappearing, and other changes in doctrine. Well, the Adventists were going through a very similar kind of thing in some ways. Dr. Froom wrote a book in the early 70s giving the history of how this happened to the Adventist Church. Dr. Froom was a Trinitarian, and he describes how what he calls the eternal verities came into the Adventist Church. Describes it in some ways, quite honestly, telling who was involved and how. So the 1958 publication was a step up. What they were doing in the 1950s also was getting rid of the old ministers. They were retiring people who were not even of retirement age. I remember seeing this, sitting in an Adventist church as a child, seeing a movie, a documentary presentation in which they showed an Adventist leader with a bald head and stooping, and were making a great issue about how we have to get the old out of the church and get young and vigorous leadership to move on. Well, what they wanted to do was to get all of the old moderate Unitarians out and get Trinitarians in. And that's exactly what they did. But the turn against Unitarian doctrine may have occurred immediately after the death of Ellen White in 1914. In 1915, Margaret Rowan claimed to be the successor of Ellen White. She put a forged document in the files, the White files, in which it was claimed that Ellen White had appointed her as successor. Margaret Rowan was first found out as a forger. She had a prominent supporter and about 1,000 followers for several years, until her her major supporter began to have second thoughts, repudiated her, called her a charlatan, and for that she came up with an elaborate plan to have him murdered, was caught and put away, and that was the end of the movement. Well, the problem here is that Margaret Rowan was very, very strongly Unitarian. She was preaching that Christ was a created being, an angel, the angel Michael, who was proclaimed the Son of God and Messiah during his incarnation. So after this movement went under, this primary doctrine, the Unitarian doctrine, was in disfavor in some eyes, and this disfavor influenced people so that those who soon began to bring Trinitarian thoughts into the church were able to do so. Infiltration of the church by who knows whom probably started much earlier than that. So this way of destroying churches